just tell us a bit about how you got into playing with bands and
right.
how that developed.
Well, my father was able to play. In 1952, I was trying to play harmonica just like my dad. He could do clarinet, bugle, trumpet. He was very, very gifted. He was not a professional musician, but that was just for fun. And then he brought back a guitar from Canada in 1957. And I was learning to play that. By the time I was 12, I was just about big enough to get my arms around the thing. And of course, that was a very explosive time in music. 1962, I think it all, in a way, started to happen. The change from the light program to Radio Luxembourg, all of that kind of stuff. So in those days, I would sometimes spend a whole evening listening to radio, and I didn't feel as though I would prefer to have a night out. It seemed to me every other song on the radio was a work of genius. I could accept anything from Del Shannon, the Beatles who were to follow, Everly Brothers, of course. It was a very exciting time in music, and no one was using the term bubblegum at the time. It just seemed that anything that was well sung and with half a sentiment, I thought was, as I say, an absolute work of genius. So I think the rest of the guys in the band probably were the same. I don't know whether they had the same facility I did, because obviously they were at school and incarcerated in that public school system. But the rest of us were running around with transistor radios glued to our ears, and long before headphones.
Yeah, Radio Luxembourg was a huge thing.
Yeah.
Well, I could digress on that, but carry on.
You should.
But you're obviously you got into music yourself, playing instruments, inspired by your dad, really.
Yeah. I think my dad died sadly just about 6 months ago now, and but he brought the music, and it was quite Catholic, in that he would listen to a bit of jazz, he would listen to a bit of this, a bit of that, and because he was a multi-instrumentalist, although he would never really call himself that, he was also a very good sportsman. So I could have had any number of careers just based on doing what my dad did naturally, jumping out of airplanes, playing cricket, playing football, playing lots of different instruments. A very, very intelligent guy, great at mathematics, and but I just seemed to specialise in one thing, really. Once I'd gotten over the idea at school, I thought, oh, maybe I'll be a gymnast, because I was in the school team, and I loved doing that. But music really started to take over, and so the gymnastics were more off the fingers once I'd given up judo and trampoline and doing somersaults on a good day. Music was what it was all about. So from the age of 16, I left school. I wanted to get away. I didn't really fancy the idea of further education. It was really all about how quickly can I either form a band or get into one.
And it was the guitar, obviously, that was your instrument.
Yeah, a guitar. Originally harmonica, and then it became guitar, and a very exciting instrument it was too. It seemed to upset my headmaster at school. I think headmasters at that time were meant to be upset, weren't they, by electric guitars? So, anything that would give my headmaster a heart attack, I thought, very good idea. So it was a great time in music. Wonderful to hear the Stones, the young vital Stones, and the Beatles, the great songwriters, and on reflection, of course, the great work that George Martin did as producer and arranger and orchestrator of those Beatles things. It was, I think, a great time in music when music was starting to grow up. I think the difference between 1962 and 1965, 1966, suddenly classical influences were popping in. World music was being born under the baton of George Martin. great stuff was starting to happen, and I think wonderful songs such as Eleanor Rigby. The idea of young guys at the age of about 24 writing compassionately about an old lady in her last days. I think, music really had grown up, and it was giving Dylan Thomas a run for its money lyrically, I think.
So, but 65, you were still only 15.
15, yeah.
Already immersed in this musical culture that was emerging, very exciting time. So, tell us, when did you leave school, and what did you set out to find a band, to find mates that you could play with? I left school at 16. I got a few O-levels. I went back after the end of the school holidays and started doing about 3 days of A-level French, and I thought, this isn't for me. I'm wasting time here. I've just got to get a move on. And it wasn't until I left school that I started reading books, really. Although I had been to grammar school, I resisted that. So I think, in a way, my education really began once I left school. So I was a self-educator then, and I am now. I'll read anything. Honestly, I'll read anything from a manual to Immanuel Kant, anything. I didn't really answer the question. Yeah. I'm famous for That's good.
wandering off the subject.
Immanuel Kant. Got to try and have that.
All right.
Yeah, no, but meeting like-minded guys.
Yes.
Forming a band.
I used to advertise in the back pages of Melody Maker, so 4 or 5 years of ads in the back. When I could afford it. I don't want to plead poverty here, but it was 1 and 6pence a word in old money. And that's really what eventually got me the gig with Genesis. I mean, it was 4 or 5 years of rejections of either myself or other people, but I did meet a tremendous amount of aspiring musicians. I made an album with a band called Quiet World, Pi Studios, so I had a little bit of recording experience. We didn't do any gigs, and then a year later I got a call from Peter Gabriel. So I always think music, in a way, if you've got something sweet and tonal and compassionate, even romantic, that's the word I'm looking for, if it's twinned with something really abrasive and as I say, atonal, I'm losing my words here. The idea of the contrast of things, I think, works really well in music. These collisions and music that works like a kind of film for the ear rather than the eye. The idea of here's a scene and here's another scene and another scene. And in order to make these things right, you've got to get good atmospheres to link them. The bridge passages have got to be really good. So that's something we tried to do in Genesis. We thought that we could join any two pieces of music if the bridge passage was good enough, and that could be anything. That could be atmosphere. It didn't always have to be something entirely musical.
It's sort of, I'm tempted now just to go straight into talk about Supper's Ready.
Supper's Ready, yeah.
I mean, there you go.
Yeah.
22 minutes or whatever it is. Extraordinary range.
Yeah.
And I think what's fascinating what you're saying is this, the kind of combination of the sweet and the clashing.
Yes.
The bombastic and the tender. It's all there in that.
Yes,
it
is. Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible, but can you remember how that developed and how that was put together, and what experiences you had doing that?
Well, I remember we were rehearsing at in the basement of a stage school. So upstairs you had girls learning to tap dance and made quite a din, in fact. So we just used to laugh at times. We just have to stop when upstairs it was going clumpity clump to dum to dum to ta 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 ta. So they were all dancing to Tea for Two upstairs at half speed, and downstairs we were
in what I think had been designed as a cafeteria, really. And we started putting this piece of music together. It really started out on 12 strings, and we were all contributing bits to that. And it just seemed to get longer and longer. You know, there was another bit that joined that sounded a little bit like something from the 60s, and then it went into something else and something else, and we didn't really stop. And by the end of it, and by the time we'd recorded this thing, I really thought the record company are going to pull the plug on us, you know, because it would be game's up, guys, you know. Instead of which, it became one of, you know, the one of the icons, really, and one of those things that defined what we now call progressive rock, but we weren't using that term at the time. Prog rock. Yep, that's it. Here it is. It's the idea of something that keeps changing scene. That's how I view it.
Do you think it's well, digression really, but
Yep.
let's follow that from it. Do you think it's kind of unhelpful to kind of plonk a label on and say, okay, progressive rock, you know, is this,
Yes.
and this?
Well, I think it is, because people generally don't call the Beatles progressive, but by the time they were doing Sgt. Pepper and working on this idea of the musical continuum, and Abbey Road, side 2, you know, you've got the equivalent. So in a way, you know, what was groundbreaking? Was it Sgt. Pepper? Was it Abbey Road? Was it Foxtrot? I mean, we were not a tremendously successful band at the time. It might seem as if, oh, you know, Genesis arrived on the scene fully developed, but we weren't really. I mean, we were just a little bit older than kids. So it took quite a while for that to establish. I mean, I think over 4 odd decades, you know, that's become accepted, isn't it? You know, but it's like people talking about Citizen Kane, going, "Oh yes, great classic film, failed in its day." Funny that, isn't it? You know, but you can't look at music like that in terms of successes and failures, because you know, from one moment to the next, Quentin Tarantino takes something that last week we thought was laughable, and now it's the latest thing again because he says it's cool, and that's the power of media, film, all of that. So music never really dies; it just gets reborn in a different form. And you know, maybe that era of Genesis, which I know is held in great affection by fans. You can look at it and say, well, actually, you know, the more commercial side is the stuff that was the hit singles, but then there's this whole other side to it. You know, a band making albums or a band making singles. What are you investing most of your efforts in? And when I started in the business, people were making singles. Singles were all important, and then Pie Records, of course, wanted to have album hits with the Dawn label. John McLaughlin was signed to that. Quiet World, this band that I was involved with a year before Genesis. And of course, ironically, they had a huge hit with Mungo Jerry. So it was back to singles for Pie, you know. But I think you can either make an album or you can make a single, or you can make a collection of potential singles. But then if you make an album that's full of potential singles, if you don't have a hit on it, no one remembers the album. They just go, well, actually, it's not the stuff that we're really interested in. So you take the two separate philosophies, Pink Floyd and pop, in a way, don't you? It's Floyd never seemed to quite subscribe fully to the idea of the pop single. It was quite the reverse, wasn't it? It was the musical continuum, the journey into outer space, wherever. But I think that it was music perhaps for people to sit around and enjoy in a different kind of way. Perhaps, you know, early 70s listening was defined by
there's a beanbag, there's a very good joint, here's a glass of wine, sit down and you've got to listen to this man because it's a real trip, and off you went with that. Not that I think that drugs are I don't think they're a career move for anybody, just to sort of distance myself from all of that, but not as lifestyle. But I'm describing the times in which we grew. It was listening to Donovan into the night. Wonder what'll happen if I smoke a banana. On the other hand, the idea that, you see, I had a girlfriend, this is a weird one, who got into drugs big time, my first girlfriend, and I saw her going through various things, rehab and what have you, and I thought, that isn't for me. I need to be straight. And in the early years of Genesis, I found that you cannot have a beer before you play this stuff, because you're gonna come a cropper. Yeah, for playing blues and beer, it's part of the whole thing. But for this stuff, you had to be on the ball for it. If you're changing time signatures, you're working in 7/8 1 minute and 4 on the next. It's you do have to be extremely centered to be able to play that kind of music.
Interesting what you were saying about the audience. I interviewed Ed Goodgold,
Right.
the man in New York who
Yes.
with the first tour, right? And Ed has a great memory of the time. And what he was saying was that when he first saw Genesis playing, was that it was kind of almost like a religious experience for the audience. It's got kind of this, what he calls about this uplifting, people were kind of buoyant from it, but they were quiet.
Yes.
They were uplifting. They were listening. It was like almost like you're listening to a preacher.
Yeah.
And Gabriel is the preacher.
Yes.
Out there.
Is the priest, and I think Supper's Ready, of course, that with the sort of allusions to revelations and all of that. I think that in a way it's extended or alternative religion, isn't it? That's being postulated in the convoluted annals of that song. Yes, I think it was very much for people. I don't think it was just casual listening. We tended to have a very intense audience who were looking for something, yes, the meaning of life as defined by not the Book of Genesis but the alternative version, the band. Yes, I think we probably gained from that. I used to think that the name Genesis was difficult for a rock band, because aren't rock bands supposed to be revolutionary and supposed to be tearing up books, not pointing to the good book? So it was a very tricky balance at times. But I think Pete was very good at being able to steer a middle course there. And of course there was Greek mythology as well, so earlier religions were being pilfered. Lots of things were influencing Genesis lyrics in those days.
Did you kind of I know you were involved in writing some material. Did you feel fully kind of, you're a new guy, in fact.
Yes.
Phil had come in, so he was a new guy, but you were an even newer guy.
Yes.
Was this a difficult one, like creatively? Because how do you, the new guy, become as one with this established bunch?
Yeah, well, that's true. I think at times the keys were closely guarded, if you know what I mean, and it was hard to penetrate, and it could be intimidating. And they were very accomplished songwriters, but I think in terms of musicianship, I was starting to develop tapping and various things. So I had a facility, so I came to the writing via being a musician, whereas I think it was coming from the opposite end. You know, the idea of the song first and then the playing to facilitate the song, or a collection of accompanists to serve the song. But of course, they're both equally valid ways of working, and I didn't always write from the point of view of here's a virtuoso performance, you know. And of course, they do say the more notes, the less women. So I know it's terribly sexist, that, but in a way, I think, you know, simple songs. If you can do that, if you can write a simple song, of course, yes, it's certainly best. But then, you know, I've got these flying fingers, and I've got to do something with them. You know, if I'm gonna be honest, you know, as a guitarist, I'm just as attracted to classical and flamenco and blues and all these other things, and they should be able to inform the mainstream. So I think by the time we were doing something like Blood on the Rooftops, I was able to use some of that. It was a song, but with a very long guitar introduction. I'm surprised they let me get away with it, really, but I'm glad they did. But yes, I think songwriting could be quite hard to penetrate the team. And so I think one of the first things I wrote with Genesis was with Phil. You know, the two of us, the new boys, went off into a corner and wrote For Absent Friends, little tiny song, which Phil sang for the first time. So we humbly presented our work to the great team, and surprise, surprise, they went for it.
But that must have been more than kind of pleasurable. I was thinking that symbolically important. Like
yes.
You know.
Well, I think so. Yeah. I think the others had more confidence in their songwriting ability than I did. But you know, by the time I'd done a solo album in 1975, I realised that I could write just as much as anybody else, and in lots of different styles. So, you know, that was important. Suddenly, you know, that was the facility to be able to switch on the tap and keep it coming, and not feel that you needed approval from everybody. You know, an idea was a good idea, whether or not people were going to go for it as a team or not. And you know, it can become very political in a band.
Was it in the early stages a kind of battle of wills over, you know, how was this album going to be worked? You know, which songs were going to be used, which themes, which, you know.
Well, I think Genesis was famous for discarding very good bits. I'm not just talking about my own stuff, but other things that, you know, stuff that Pete had written, for instance. And it was amazing to me that we would put things on a back burner, and it troubled me, you know. I would push for certain things, and you realise that in order to get something done, sometimes you would have to be extremely bloody minded, and at times threaten, you know, because I think they'd grown up at school with this kind of cut and thrust thing. You know, I think in another era they would have all been trained to lead a charge in the Crimea and not flinch. Okay. Now, you know, they were raised to rule. There's no doubt about it. That's how it is. So yeah, sometimes it would turn into all-out war. But you know, I think in any negotiation you've got to be prepared to lose. That's the strongest possible position. So I thought, well, if I lose my job with this, then so be it. But I'm still proud of selling England by the pound, because it's got a lot of great guitar moments in it. It's the best for me. I think some of the others were less happy about it because perhaps, you know, they hadn't gotten their own way. But I felt that it was a vital role for me at that time. More difficult with Lab Lies Down, following very dense keyboard patterns. Hard for anyone to get anything in there. Hard to get guitar lines that matched up. You know, what do I do? Join the keyboard, or double the bass. I had to really rack my brains to come up with anything remotely relevant at that time beyond contributing songs.
In the Selling England, the Firth of Fifth.
Yeah.
Great stuff from you in that, which, talking to Daryl, he later played live when the band were playing in the 80s, but took his hat off to you for the extraordinary kind of creativity that you put into that. Do you see that as very much a kind of signature track for you for Firth of Fifth? That you put
I think so.
Your mark on there.
Well, it's a very lyrical melody, I'm really searching for the right words here because I don't want to sort of just be glib about it, but there is a style of music that Genesis became known for, and I think without Firth of Fifth it would have been all the poorer for it. So you've got classical sensibility, you've got something that's slightly Indian sounding, that's slightly Eastern. There's even an aspect of French Impressionism in there. I know it sounds pretentious to say all this, doesn't it? A bit of Eric Satie. It could have been one of the Gnossiennes in terms of the type of melody originally written on piano and doubled on flute. But guitar is really what makes it take off that thing. So it was really, really important for me being able to be let loose on that and have a great long guitar solo, because the theme was strong, so you could move away from it, you could tease people into it, and then the idea of the band, suddenly organ gets joined by a mellotron, gets joined by a bass pedal and arpeggios, and the second time the theme comes in, it's gone really big. So it was orchestration, I think, as much as anything else, arrangement that I think it's probably the band at its most orchestral, but it's still rock without being gauche. It's still relevant, and probably the most famous solo I've been involved with in my time. Yeah.
Is it possible to give us a kind of little sense of how you saw each band member when you first joined? There you are, apparently.
Right.
According to, I'm not going to quote Mike's book, but Mike said that I think he was in bed or in his dressing gown or something.
Yes.
You came upstairs to meet him.
Yes.
What was your impression of them as characters and who they were, as people?
Right. Well, I first met Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks. They came to my parents' flat where I was living. Mike was living at home, but Pete seemed to do all the talking. Mike and Tony was very, very, very quiet. So I didn't really get to find out what Tony was, about at all. And 6 months after I joined the band, Tony said to me, "I really liked what you played that day." 6 months later, on the day, there's Pete, very forthright, going, "Oh, I think you like this bit, not sure about that bit," So, so Tony seemed to be much more reflective, guarded, repressed, but obviously fiercely intelligent and a great writer. Mike Rutherford, yes, I'd sort of passed the audition, I felt, with Pete and Tony, and they said, "Oh, you must meet our other guitarist, Mike, because you really got to be able to get on with him." And Mike was not well at home, and I think he was in his dressing gown or pajamas in bed. So we had both our guitars out, and it was the strangest thing because it took a lot of the steam out of it for me. Had I been auditioning and I'd been one of 40 guys all queuing up round the corner,
it would have been different. I would have been very nervous. But as it happened with Mike, we started swapping chord shapes immediately. And I thought, it's just too strange for words, playing with this guy who's in bed recovering. So none of it seemed threatening. And at that time, I didn't really mind. I didn't really know who Genesis were. I mean, I'd heard a little bit of the first album, or the second album actually, and I didn't have the money to go out and buy it. So I went off to Smith's in Sloane Square and listened to it in a booth, the recommended track, which was Stagnation by at that time. So my brother and I were listening to this thing in a booth, thinking, oh, that's interesting. Can't really tell if that's guitar or keyboard. What is that sound? And it turned out it was massed 12 strings. So they already had that sound, and I'd sometimes had the money to buy a 12 string, and I think I'm going to have to sell my 12 string in order to get the electric to do this. And but luckily, joining the band, it meant that I could have both a 12 string and a Les Paul that suddenly showed up, and a high watt stack. So, oh, great! Anyone who's got this has already made it. I thought in those days, you've got a Les Paul, if you've got a Marshall stack, you've already made it, haven't you? You've got the Maserati. The rest is just plain sailing.
What about Phil at that point?
Phil. Well, Phil was a new boy too, and he was very open. I thought, he's Cockney guy. I had no idea that he'd been in Oliver, that he'd played the part of the Artful Dodger. I thought, oh yes, this guy's the drummer. It was such a surprise to find out not only could he drum, but he could sing wonderfully too. So when I saw them on stage, I thought there was some kind of double track effect on Pete's voice, and I suddenly realised, that's the drummer there doing a very tight double track, and it was a great sound. They had a great vocal sound together.
So you saw them performing live before you joined them?
A couple of times, yeah. I saw a show at the Lyceum in London, a free Christmas Day show, I think it was. Lunchtime show, I think it was. And then I saw them at the Toby Jug pub, and I could see them a little bit closer there, and it seemed more powerful. It was more. They had stuff that was really. I mean, the equipment was really designed for pub level performance. I think they weren't very loud when it was at the Lyceum, so it didn't come across with the kind of power that I knew that they needed. But a lot of bands were like that at the time. People weren't carrying huge PAs at that time, so.
So in that first period, were you? I know Nursery Cryme came quite quickly.
Yeah.
Was it touring immediately when you first joined?
Yeah. When I first toured with them, we were straight away doing this tour up and down the country for a very low ticket price. Charisma Records were putting on 3 bands together.
This is the 6 Bob tour.
Yes, it was Genesis, it was Lindisfarne, it was Van der Graaf Generator. All the bands were different. I was very nervous. I was new boy. I was very nervous. In those days, I think in the early days of rehearsals, it was like Mike was the one who did the settings on my amp and said, I think you should use this fuzz box and you should do that. And I had no idea, and I'd sometimes put my foot full down for a solo, and I'd be either deafening if you were in the line of the stack that I was using, or I'd be inaudible if you were slightly to the side of it, because we weren't miking up the amps in the way that people do as a matter of course these days. So yes, I was either deafening or silent. Funny. And the first gig I did, I was terrified, and I got it all wrong. I borrowed Fuzzbox, terrible, forgot everything. Second gig,
teachers training college in Bangor in Wales, playing in a classroom to 3 people. So that was a paid rehearsal. And then it was the Lyceum, which was really the biggest gig you could do in London at the time. That was my 3rd gig. So my mother says on the day, "You were green, dear. I could see that you were worried. You were green." But it was fine. And after the gig, when it was all done and we'd done the encore and everything, Richard MacPhail, who was mixing sound, very kindly came out and led me away from the stage. Said, "It's over now, Steve. You know." Had to lead me away. I was like a shell shock victim, you know, at the end of it. Have I got this right or not? And it was an extraordinary moment. I just had rehearsed everything other than the ability to be able to leave the stage.
Sounds like one of those career moments where are you sort of blinking, saying, "Blimey, the Lyceum, you know, I've arrived.
Yeah.
I've really arrived."
Something like that, yes.
Suddenly, very quickly, too.
Yes. Yes, I think so. I mean, any idea of success, of course, was fleeting. The fact that we might have gotten an encore, it completely went over my head. I think for the next 5 years, that went over my head. I just thought, no, we're just trying to get this right, aren't we? And by the time we were achieving a measure of success, I couldn't quite believe it, because I thought, no, actually, the real relationship is with the music, and this relationship with fans, it's you're at the mercy of media, so many things. Do they like you this week? Do they hate you? So I guess that makes me sound very serious, doesn't it? It was concentrating on the music, but it was just, you know, it's always the music that fed you and consoled you in those times when you were having a hit, you weren't having a hit, oh, you're having a hit again. And that's strange, and you have to get used to that in music. I think, you know, to have the ability to release an album and always have it sell more than the previous one, I think that run of luck can go on for a while, but there comes a moment, even if you're Elvis, when it catches up with you and it's, they didn't like that one quite as much as, I wonder why. Back to the drawing board.
So, interesting, because, so I'm just, there's a creaking of chairs.
Yes, I'm going to.
Is it Graham?
I'm going to stand up.
Yeah, sorry, it's just quite a lot of creaking.
Yeah, can I give that to you?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that, guys.
That's all right. You okay? Yeah.
Could be creaky knees, of course, couldn't it?
Yes, it will carry
They're
on.
mine.
Yeah.
If they're mine, they
Knee
creak.
stretch, yeah.
Yeah.
Writing Nursery Cryme.
Yeah.
So it's the first experience you had of actually writing with these guys.
Yeah.
We've touched on that a little bit, but was that I don't know if it's a silly question, but did you sort of feel when you were working on that, okay, frustrating in some ways, and there's this sort of arguments and the level of you know, like cut and thrust was tough and stuff. But did you have a sense of like, oh yeah, this is what I want to be doing. This is my thing. I've chosen the right thing and the right band.
Well, I'd worn them down to the point where they got a mellotron. I wanted to work with a mellotron. There's no doubt about that. To expand the keyboard arsenal so that we could sound like an orchestra. And when we were working on Nursery Cryme, it seemed wonderful to me. You know, I had everything I wanted. I had a Les Paul. I had a high watt stack. We had a Mellotron Mark II. We had a summer off to write a whole album, and it seemed absolutely wonderful to me the way it was taking shape. Many great melodies, and I often thought, am I really up to this? Am I up to this standard? But I marvelled at the way it took shape. I didn't love every song. Don't get me wrong here. I wasn't a fan in that way where you'll just embrace everything. I was critical. I was self-critical, but I could see that the detail was important to everyone. And by the time we were doing The Fountain of Salmacis, which was the final track on that album, I felt something wonderful was happening. By the time I managed to put some guitar on the end of the repeated chord sequence at the end, I thought, oh, here's my moment. I could steam into this, and it sounded wonderful. Of course, in those days, we didn't have a stabilizer on the mellotron, and the fluctuations in power meant that by the end of the song, the mellotron ended up in a different key. So it was the frustrations there, but nonetheless, there were glimpses of Nirvana. And it was all important to have those glimpses of how wonderful it could be. And by the time we recorded the album, I was very proud of it. Particularly the mellotron, we couldn't get that sounding right at Trident, and then we ended up renting Air London, I think it was, George Martin's studio in Oxford Street, and we hooked up a couple of big amps and mic'd the thing from one end of the room to the other, and so those crescendos sounded really, 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 really great. We really went for it. We pulled out all the stops, I think.
It's funny hearing you talking about it, because it sounds like this band is very successful now, and it's got the money to buy this equipment and so on. But it turned out, in fact, when Tony Smith came on board, that they were actually in hock to the record company by several £100,000.
Yes, unfortunately. I think, part of the rock and roll ethos is beg, borrow or steal, and don't worry where it's coming from too much, because, if you're counting the pennies, you'll never get off the starting blocks. Someone's got to front that money. So, yes, all the investment was emotionally in the music for me, and yes, it certainly was depressing. By the time we toured Lamb Lies Down on Broadway for 9 months, practically 9 months straight, and lost our lead singer, Peter Gabriel, at the end of it, we were in the hole for £250,000. Very depressing when you're really shattered coming off of a long tour. Very depressing indeed. But, that's the price of admission in rock and roll. At times, the cost of production and the cost of success can sometimes outweigh success in fiscal terms, and you just have to hope that at some point there'll be a catch up. You renegotiate this, you renegotiate that, but I think that Genesis had a very fine manager in Tony Smith, and of course the other Tony Smith, Tony Stratton Smith, who originally put his money in to that little band called Genesis, is all important too. I mean, how is it possible? Synchronicity. Here we are. Two guys both called Tony Smith. What's going on? It must have pointed out something. And then we got was it 3 Aquarians in the band and an Aquarian manager? That's strange. Not that I'm a great believer in all of that, but again, synchronous stuff there.
Hadn't thought of that.
Oh no.
It's a good one.
There you go. Clues, cosmic clues.
What was your experience of if you can remember the sort of the first times that Peter started donning costumes and masks and became more theatrical in performance? How did you feel about it? What did you experience?
I could see why he did it. The moment he put on makeup and a gold necklace, and we were doing a festival somewhere, and suddenly we're on the front pages of Melody Maker and all that kind of stuff. And by the time he's wearing a fox's head and his wife's red dress, again, great press from that. So whatever one thought, individually, I'm quite sure there were, quite a lot of raised eyebrows amongst the team. But Pete, bless him, was a prize hustler, always on the phone, late for rehearsals because he was always on the phone. But then, you know, who's to say? You know, he was hustling a deal here, a deal there, all of that, and you know, one man's lack of professionalism is another man's nous, isn't it? So that's really, really important. I think Pete was extremely important to the band's success. I think everybody was important to the band's success, but you know, Pete had that go-getter kind of quality. I'll always be grateful for the fact that he's the guy who called me up. You know, he's first in there, isn't he? With the funny hat, or the, you know, I know it seems laughable now and much parodied, but nonetheless, you can't argue with having your picture on the front of Melody Maker. So I think it's this sort of thing. People can't really write about music. What can you say? You say, oh, the bass player drove it along, the guitarist was fiery, the keyboard player was erudite, the drummer was tricky and clever, and the vocals were impenetrable. But you know, all that is swept aside when someone says, and the laser did this, or the video did that, or the dancing girls in the wings did that. So something visual is all important, which is, you know, I've come full circle these days and working with LED screens, but that's another story, because I think an aspect of theatricality can get the audience over the difficulties of the music, and you hope that no one notices that this thing's in a difficult time signature. It doesn't really matter. I think, you know, as long as they got something to look at, that's part of it. So, yes, lead singers are very important, I think.
But when you take something like Musical Box, where you know, it's the whole arc of a story, and the costume changes, and you end up with the you know, it's kind of a pathos in the old man coming on. Yeah, it becomes something very different from listening to Musical Box on, you know, sitting at home listening to it on the record. I mean, it's an entirely different experience from you know. And
I agree.
It changes it. I mean, it was, to me, it's actually pretty unique, really, in the history of popular music in a way. Yeah. That Peter did this. I'm not sure that people realise it. I mean, as you say, it's easily parodable now. Yes. But at the time, wow.
Well, it borrows from a number of things, doesn't it? But yes, it's theatre. It's part pantomime. It's pathos. Yes, it borrows from opera. So you get the storyteller band aspect, the little operetta. You get all of that, and these things are not really part of rock and roll. They're not really part of a band just chugging into some riffs. But what it did do was to give the band a kind of fairy tale quality. Once we've got our own light show, once we had the mellotron, once we had the synth, you know, suddenly you've got the ability to be a time machine. You can sound like a group 1 minute, and you can sound like an orchestra the next, and you can sound like a choir the next. And all these things are a given these days when you sit down with keyboards and there's 1,000 patches and any sound you want on tap. But in those days, I think it was very important that you could, you know, you could be part this, you could be part that. You could, if you wanted to, you could be a little bit of kabuki theatre. If you wanted, you could be this. You could be flexible, and it could change. And we used to use ultraviolet lights, and sometimes we'd use the UV lights and leave them on, because that would colour the rest of the lights and make the reds look infrared. And you'd be looking at the band thinking, you know, they look a little bit like they're on television. They look a little bit unreal. What's going on there? This kind of odd, quirky kind of look. And this mixture, I think, of a band that was, part big band with the influence of Phil and the time signatures, and part the influence of even song from Tony. And I think it was a heady mixture of things that shouldn't really coexist in the same song, but it would swing in a certain kind of way. It was a very, it was a kind of collision of things, or a fusion of ideas. And I think the American jazzers who were going through this sort of rock jazz fusion, we didn't realize that they were listening to us at the same time we were listening to them. We thought that the way it works is that, we're the little guys on this side of the pond, and they're the big guys because they live in the big country. So, guys like Alphonso Johnson and Chester Thompson, these guys are taking on board what we did. And we're listening to John McLaughlin with Mahavishnu and Miles Davis and all this kind of stuff. So it's extraordinary, really. I find the way that different things, that there ought to have been phase cancellation from that, but no, there was communication, and it was put together in one song. I don't think it was dependent on the length of the song. Genesis was capable of doing a short 3-minute tune like I Know What I Like, and also capable at the same time of writing something like Supper's Ready, 23 odd minutes long.
Was going to America, did that help this kind of crossover?
Playing in America was tricky at first. They didn't really get it when we started playing these acoustic sections, so the tinkly 12 strings. They would heckle us and it would get drowned out. Over time, that improved, but I think it made us come up with a more urban, tougher kind of sound, which is what I think led to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Taking Coles to Newcastle, of course, an English band with a story set on Broadway.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't quite heard that. That's great insight, actually, because the thing that's always struck me about is this very English band with storytelling, nursery rhyme background, all that sort of Englishness,
Victoriana.
And then you go slam bam into an American setting, and a much more a harder sound in a way.
Yes.
And so what you're saying is that because the audience didn't quite get those strange little quirky bits, this was almost like a conscious move.
Oh well, I think it was. It was a troubled time because Pete was in the band, and he was out of the band, and he was in the band, and he was out of the band, and he wasn't sure that he wanted to continue with that. And I appreciate that, because they'd had a long history and a competitive history together, and Pete was obviously headed towards a solo career by the time he was doing Lamb Lies Down with us. I remember Robert Fripp coming to the Wembley gig we were doing, and he said to me, it seems obvious that Pete is pulling in a different direction to the rest of you. And of course, we knew this, and we knew that he was going to leave by the time he'd fulfilled the gig commitments, and so we toured for 9 months practically straight. No one wanted to say goodbye to Peter. I tried to convince him to stay. I loved him, still do. And of course, this was just the beginning for Pete. So many things he was to become, including not just a sort of a world force as a producer, but as a humanitarian and many other things. And I've got a huge respect for his orientation towards world music and the association with WOMAD. Absolute visionary as regards that.
So back this sort of the maelstrom of this period of Lamb. To what extent? You see, there seems a contradiction in a way in Pete there, because this could be seen as his big project.
Yes.
You know, apparently his concept, and he wanted to write all the lyrics to it.
Yes.
His big project. I haven't interviewed him yet, but I'm going to ask him.
Yes.
You know, why sort of start to be ambivalent and sort of distance yourself at the very point when you've got this massive, ambitious project that could be seen as the iconic Genesis double album, you know, concept album. I mean, is there a did you feel it was?
Well, I think that he had domestic pressures. His wife had just given birth. It had been rather complicated. They weren't sure if his daughter was going to live. So, you know, obviously there's a difference. You know, young guys in their 20s, and suddenly there are families, and it's not quite so easy to get it together in the country, man, in the cottage, when you're, you know, when your wife's ill in hospital somewhere else. So I also think that even when I first joined the band, Pete was saying to me, I don't think composition by committee really works. Now, I hadn't really worked with a team before, so I didn't really know what he was talking about. But at times, obviously, it could be very competitive. And I sensed that he felt thwarted at times. So I do sympathise.
So did you feel, when you decided to leave, you feel, I'm letting these guys down? Was it, you know, did you agonise about this? I mean,
I did, yes. It was 2 years of agony, thinking whether I'm going to stay in the band or not. I mean, once you've had success on your own, it's very tempting. I thought, but do I let them down, or do I let myself down? Because in order to fully develop my songwriting, I had to have a green light with every idea. And, you know, people are putting blocks in front of me with stuff. And
sounds very frustrating.
It can be frustrating. Not everyone, and not on every instance, but it would worry me, the things that we would leave off albums and the things we would leave on. And it seemed obvious to me that it wasn't the best way to serve the interests of the music. So I always come back to the idea that I am the servant of music, pompous though that might sound, and I've got to serve the music, whatever it is. And so I've got my own goals and my own God to follow in that way. And I always want to be true to that. I think that if I'd stayed in Genesis and done all that, I'm quite sure I would have been a total alcoholic by now. So I, you know, great pile in the country, but what about all those albums I did afterwards? You know, the chance to play Bach, to do Eric Satie, to do jazz rock, to do any one of a number of things. So I always think that music is its own currency, it's its own reward, and I wouldn't have done Spectral Mornings, which is probably my best loved album for fans. It's not the one that had any hit singles on, but I had, you know, single success elsewhere with GTR and Cell 151 a few years before that with Highly Strung. But, you know, the level of success that the band had was enormous. And of course, you know, I remember having a conversation with Pete where I probably shouldn't say this. And I really ought to sort of edit myself before I get into trouble. But I'll say it to you because I suspect you're not going to use it. But, you know, Pete was saying to me, I can't even go anywhere and take a leak these days without hearing Phil Collins being beamed over the you know, over the hi-fi in any restaurant I go in. And I said, I know exactly what you mean. I had exactly the same experience going to Lake Tahoe and off for a skiing trip, and it had been very difficult, and the plane had landed in a blizzard, and I was all shaky. Managed to go in somewhere, and just about to, just go in the gents, and there's Phil with, and I can't remember whether it was In the Air Tonight or something from Genesis, but there was huge success, obviously, and but I've always said to myself that no, actually, success in worldly terms and in spiritual terms are two very different things, and the spirit of music is what I've always tried to honour, and if that means playing Wembley, great. If it means playing a club, great, because you can enjoy both for whatever it happens to be. I mean, it happens to be I just played the Albert Hall, great, lovely, but equally I loved playing in Ireland in a pub called Wayland's, and because the Irish have got this musical tradition, and when we powered into the first chord, I thought, it's never going to be make or break. I'm playing a pub, for God's sake. But the idea that you can do no wrong, the world's cameras are not watching at that point. So there's a price, for a certain level of success.
Did you get flack when you left from the fans?
No, I think that some people were disappointed that I left, and the music plainly changed after I left for whatever reason. But I think that was to do with the beginning of the video era, as we know it, and the difference between making albums and people becoming obsessed, or record companies being obsessed with the idea of you having hit singles. It's two different sensibilities.
I mean, in a sense, the period that you were in Genesis, sort of
71 to 77.
To 77,
yeah,
is considered by many to be the kind of classical period of the classical lineup, and the huge number of people who absolutely adore that period of music. And you kind of feel, in a way, I mean, I don't know whether this is something that was happening to you, that popular music was changing. You got to the excesses of bands like Yes and so on were beginning to bore people, and you had punk starting and two-tone, and and maybe it was a time. The right time for you to leave and pursue new avenues, and for this band to change.
Yes,
they did.
Yes, it certainly was an interesting time in music. It was no longer possible to fall back on virtuosity. Obviously, by the time punk arrived, you're talking about minimalism, in a sense, and minimalism afforded the ability to just picked up a guitar a couple of weeks beforehand and be able to go ding dong ding dong. You like that? Yeah, that's the thing. Now, of course, my wife won't hear that, so whoever it is isn't going to be able to get in. It might be someone who wants to move the van or something.
Oh, right, yeah.
I don't know.
Let's cut.
I think that maybe underlying what I'm asking is Mike's book, to some degree, lifted the lid a little bit on the competitive side of things.
Yeah,
it's always been presented as Genesis, bunch of guys who always gone on so well together. And it's like great sort of team working together, writing together. But I mean, clearly there was a frustration in what you experienced, which they probably may not have realised to the extent to which you experienced it.
Right.
Where stuff that you felt very strongly about was just being left out and ignored.
Well, I think I remember doing Wind and Wuthering, and the last album I was to be involved with the band. We were using a Bayon rhythm, a boom, 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 boom. And there was a piece which I had, which eventually I did a year after I left, called Please Don't Touch. Now, we'd rehearsed that as Genesis, and we used the same rhythm on another piece, which was called What Gorilla on Wind and Wuthering. And I couldn't for the life of me work out why we'd used that and not the other piece. Maybe the other piece was too complicated, perhaps. But it became a stage favourite of mine. So, the thing is that fans responded to that. But, I had to leave the band in order to be able to do that, to prove that worthy, to take it to the masses. And I remember doing the track, I think it's called Inside and Out, and we used it on an EP, but it plainly should have been on the album. It was very strong. We had a little bit too much at that time, but I don't know. The choices seem strange to me. The stuff that I felt was strong. I was plainly coming up with lots of ideas at this point, but I got credits on four songs, and that it was a little tough to take, because I was at the point where Tony and Mike didn't want me to have a separate solo career, but without any guarantee of the songs that I was writing getting done by the band. They weren't prepared to give me guarantees. So I felt that a gun was being held to my head. And much as I loved them as songwriters and as guys, I felt that, if I'm really going to have self-respect, I can't stay in this band.
Seems really clearly explained.
Yeah.
Is that the impression you think that you left them with, though? I mean, because when you left, the story is that you kind of didn't turn up to the studio one day. And,
yeah. Well, I think that's slightly disingenuous. The idea he didn't turn up at the studio one day. Oh, it was a surprise to us. I don't think that's quite. That's quite it. Having done a solo album, I think that perhaps if that hadn't been a success when I was in the band, it might have made it a little easier. But I don't think Tony and Mike wanted to create another Pete, as they put it. They didn't want another star in the midst. And this as a result of a conversation that we were having in 1976. But then, of course, some years later, what happened? Phil happened. So, I don't think I was the great threat that they imagined I was. And of course, I can only imagine what it must have been like for them to accept the fact that you can't have a band without having stars. You can't do it. And but I do think that Genesis was, how can I put this tactfully? I don't think that it would have happened without all of those individuals. I think everyone was key to it because everyone felt passionately about what they did and the contributions that they made. And in my case, it was pushing the band to get an expanded keyboard arsenal, pushing the band to get a light show, heading towards the way it looked and sounded. And I tried to be an in-house critic. That's what I thought was my role. It's a very difficult role to assume because on one hand you're trying to be the glue, but at the same time you've got to be honest and say to people when you don't think things are working, without people being honest. And it was very difficult. I'd sometimes get my head bitten off, But you've got to try and get the best out of people that you're working with. So I felt my role was to, if I saw someone doing something wonderful in a corner. If I heard something that Mike was doing that sounded great, or a rhythm that Phil was doing that sounded great, I would be immediately enthusiastic about it. And if I could hear Tony doing something wonderful, I would immediately say, I think we should use that. And that's the way it worked. So I had to do a certain amount of ego massaging, because I think it's an important part of being a team player. If you don't do that, what are you going to do? Think, that sounds a bit too good. Better not use it. It's a way to go. Lots of bands do function like that, and you can row people out, But yeah, I think it's a shame it didn't last. I think that had it been more democratic, and had we given each other more space, you would have had a band currently treading the boards called Genesis. But I find myself I've done a year's worth of Genesis songs in front of the public, and there seems to be, a huge audience for that. I'm doing another year of it because I'm very proud of the stuff I did with Genesis, and I do it because I love it, not because it's increased the size of my audience by 2/3, because I shall ditch it again after this year, and I'll go back to doing my own stuff. But where does one thing end and the other begin? You can't separate yourself from your contribution to the band. I was very proud of the band.
When you are playing stuff now, live Genesis songs,
yeah,
do you have particular favourites that you just, even after all this time, you still love playing?
Yeah, Fountain of Salmacis I think is beautiful. The band did a lovely version of it last year. I love doing Musical Box because at the time when we first started to do it, the audience hadn't really made up their mind. It's the closing section of that song that really punches it home, and it's as much about the vocals, it's as much about the instrumental part that takes it out. So the harmony guitar bit on it that Brian May tells me he was influenced by, those are proud moments for me.
Musical Box, I always feel, along with Supper's Ready, that from that first period when you were there, that those are the two tracks that really have a kind of emotional pull. Especially at the end of Musical Box. It's very emotional. Audiences, I've seen an audience react to a tribute band, Musical Box play, and the audience is just carried, and it's you can hear a pin drop at that point when he comes in as the old man. So.
It's a heady mixture, isn't it, of Victoriana and sexuality, and of course the Victorians repressed that, so you get this kind of Freudian clash of the two, and it's just incendiary. The touch me moment, it's it blasts through everything, doesn't it? It's on one level it's adolescent, on another level it's there's nothing quite like it, really, is there? It's a strange hybrid of opposites, and that's its strength, I think.
I think it's a surprise in a way that we talked a little bit about the repressed public school background, of these guys.
Yes.
Where emotions are just not talked about.
Yeah. Yes.
And but there you get in the Musical Box and in Supper's Ready, it's very, very powerful emotions coming through musically.
Yep. Yes, I think they were designed to be different men, weren't they? They were. I think the local music shop was out of bounds for the school. And I can only imagine that the music must have been beaten into them literally, but music was always a symbol of freedom. It's like Nureyev being beaten by his father, tried to beat the dancing out of him. It's never going to happen. There are other examples of that. Of course, Leonard Bernstein, his father, violently opposed to the idea of him becoming a musician. Well, I think it produces very fine work very often, because you not only is there the fight to achieve a level of proficiency in your chosen craft, but you've got the other generation trying to stop you. So I think that it makes for a decisiveness, perhaps, in the music, and that it's a lifeline because and you're being threatened with violence. It's a way of dealing with it, and music will always be this symbol of freedom. Playing guitar, it's always going to fly in the face of everything that we were taught at school. Playing guitar, playing electric guitar, heresy. Monastic orders are founded on heresy, aren't they? They create little cells, and then those cells infiltrate out and become religions in themselves. You were talking about the religious aspect of Genesis, and it's still unfashionable to like Genesis, I think, for all sorts of reasons, because it was public school, because it didn't have street credibility, because it was posh, because it was this, because it was that, and it counted against us, I think, in the early days. Articles written calling it public school pop. Try and fight back from that, but the band did.
Yeah, you and Phil, neither of you went to public school.
No, we don't. No, we didn't. We were. I was grammar school. They don't exist anymore. So, well, not really. Phil was stage school. So yes, we were from very different backgrounds. But I suppose there was a kind of elitism at work. It was a terrible time in a sense, to have passed the 11 plus. But my best mate at primary school went off to be a Morlock, and that was, I think, terrible at that time, that children were divided. It's always a compromise, isn't it? This educational lark. But now it's very different. I was invited to play at a school in Bishop Stortford over one Christmas. One of the pupils had learnt a couple of pieces of mine to play on flute, and quite spontaneously they said, "And would you like to talk to the school?" After nothing prepared, and I ended up thinking, "Oh God, this would have been terrible if I'd been at school myself and giving a speech to the school." But I just said how refreshing I thought it was that schools nowadays have their own, or in this case they certainly did, their own recording studio. They were encouraged to embrace all kinds of music. How it had changed since the days when the barbed wire fences were up to keep pop away from young minds. The devil's music.
Very good. To shift you into another,
sure.
Blood on the Rooftops.
Yeah.
One of the songs that did get included on Genesis album that you wrote. Would you like to talk about that and how that came about? I had the idea of a long tune that had a classical guitar introduction to it with flamenco overtones to it. Phil had an idea of a lyric. He said, "I've got this idea of blood on the rooftops," and he had a chorus. He said, "All I've got is this line, blood on the rooftops," and I said, "What's that about?" And he said, "Oh, prison breakout. They're up on the roofs with their grievances and things being written on sheets." So I thought, okay, TV. What if all the action happens on the TV and you're channel surfing, you're moving from one channel to another, so it's a little bit of the news, it's a little bit of this, there's a bit of Batman, and then there's a bit of a game show, and there's a bit of this and a bit of that. So it's two people viewing the TV, and it's father and son, and the father has seen it all. He doesn't want to watch the news because
he's been through the war. He knows what that's all about. So I guess it's apolitical in a sense. But I don't. At the time when I wrote it, I didn't really know what I was trying to say. To be honest, I was just collaging. It was one of my list songs. And you can write lyrics like that. You can have a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, because they make sense to me. But I was trying to draw some kind of frame around all the various things that were happening with the TV.
Was working with Phil, did that kind of gel on that song? Was it?
Yeah, it did. We came up with a very good chorus on it, a very unobvious melody on the chorus. And I wrote I wrote verses in this intro in the style. I was thinking of Jimmy Webb because I absolutely loved Jimmy Webb's work. The unusual chords that Jimmy Webb has employed so effectively in so many songs. And Jimmy Webb was a guy who was influenced by the English. He was a great fan of Vaughan Williams. So as a preacher's son, he was playing organ in church. It's not a million miles away from Tony, is it? You know, that influence of church music and for an American New England approach. And I remember that we did an interview for Melody Maker at one point, the band, and we were all asked what was our favourite single. And 4 out of 5 of us, without conferring, because we were all being interviewed separately, said MacArthur Park. So we all loved that. The idea of the 7-minute song that was not just verse, chorus. It had this other bit in the middle, and then it went off into an instrumental. So you have the blueprint for a lot of what Genesis was to do. If you start looking at songs such as Musical Box and Fountain of Some Artists, for instance, you've got roughly that kind of length. But it's not the great opus that was Supper's Ready, but it's quite a comfortable length because if you happen to like the subject matter, you get your story told, and you get to stretch out instrumentally as well, and not be completely restrained to verse, chorus. But it's a storytelling facility, I think.
How long is Blood on the Rooftops actually?
Ooh, I haven't timed it. I don't know. I think that's probably more like the 5 or 6 minute mark.
Yeah, but it's certainly not a 3-minute single.
No, it's not a quickie.
You've got this great opening guitar. Goes on quite a long time.
It does go on a very long time. As I say, I was surprised that I was allowed to do it, really. But they must have thought it was good enough to use. Yeah. You want me to say more about it?
Well,
no, I was proud of it. I really liked the intro. But it's one of those things that I was surprised that anyone else liked it. I was doing something that was a very personal song. I was being bloody minded enough to do that. You see, I grew up listening to Segovia as well, and and that was one of my heroes, and
hence the flamenco.
Yeah, and the Spanishy influence and all of that, and a little bit of Bach and a little bit of this and that. So I liked the idea of nylon guitar being used with rock because people hadn't really done that up to that point. So there were a few tunes on Wind and Wuthering, like Unquiet Slumbers for the Sleepers, that allowed that, you know, where maybe Dave Henschel, who was co-producing with us, said, this is a little bit like South American music, isn't it? You know, it had that slightly Villa-Lobos kind of sound to it. It wasn't pop, it wasn't jazz, but it was something else.
Just when we first started talking, you were talking about how you can have this kind of contrast in, you know, and I think you mentioned the track in the Lamb where you're just all making lots of little sounds.
Yeah, the waiting room. Yes.
The waiting room.
Yeah.
Now, Phil actually in his interview talked about that track.
Right.
And how I seem to remember him saying that it was during a thunderstorm, and you're all making these weird, really strange noises, and that you can hear the rain and the thunder. And he said when you finished at the end, the rain stopped, and there was an incredible rainbow came outside.
Right.
And it was like
he's probably talking about rehearsing the waiting room at the time. So that would have defined itself with the elements of the song and the reflection of that outside. Were we reflecting the weather, or was it the other way round?
Do you remember that?
I don't. But it was a long time ago. I don't remember that at all. But it's interesting that obviously Phil's memory of that would be completely different to mine. But I'm very pleased that the band did it. I mean, I don't think I'm doing anything quite as radical as that with my own current album I'm working on at the moment. Isn't that strange? That the young radical.
It struck me as sort of like the Floyd doing. They attempted to do an album where they used wine glasses and all kinds of industrial sounds.
Right.
In fact, they shelved it.
Yes.
They didn't, but they did end up using the wine glasses on "Wish You Were Here."
Right.
Yeah. And it struck me that sort of period of that "Wish You Were Here" was 74, 75. You guys were kind of feeling you were free to do virtually anything with sound.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Well, yes. I think that when I joined, it seemed as if there was this emphasis on verse and chorus and structure, form versus spirit at times, and I thought it might be good for the band to do something which was against the grain and anathema to them, and that's why the waiting room took shape. Completely atonal. This goes back to the first day I'd auditioned for them, and here was my rejected idea being represented, and the band's going with it at this point. So we've come full circle, in a way. And I don't think it's the most wonderful thing that Genesis ever did, but it is on an extreme because there's nothing quite like it. Nothing like it from the band. We did some extraordinary live versions of it. And if the CDs of those live versions ever get to be released, warts and all, I'd be very happy. So this stuff does exist, and there are some great performances of it where people have really let themselves go and taken the plunge rather than to be too reticent about it. Because I think atonal stuff, and we've all heard orchestras do this stuff, and when it's undertaken with an air of restraint, I don't think it quite works in the same way that it does when you hear Miles Davis doing it, Black Beauty, for instance, and there doesn't seem to be any form. You just get the feeling that the band leader's just pointing to this bloke and this bloke, and they're going off and doing something extraordinary with this abandonment of keys. I think it's the track called Directions, actually. I think it's a Joe Zawinul track. And in pre-Weather Report days. And I felt, we were touching on some of the same territory, perhaps less virtuosically, but nonetheless, that's where jazz had ended up, and that's where Genesis were headed, even for 5 minutes.
Last couple of things, I think, but In the Cage.
Yeah.
Have you got a particular affection for In the Cage?
I think it's a 5-against-2 rhythm. I think that's what the band used to call it. I tried to do a counterpoint to it with power chords. It's a strange track, isn't it? Yes.
I mentioned it because Darryl played it quite a bit in the 80s live.
Yes.
But he was talked to us about how impressed he was at what you'd done on it, and how you grappled with trying to achieve that.
Well, I think that what I played on that was not any great shakes on that particular track.
were you using different instruments that maybe he wasn't that? I mean,
maybe
attachments.
Well, I was using fuzz boxes and things, and a part of it, Eno was involved with working on the album. For one day, he came in and he had some boxes, and we put things through his boxes, and so he did some guitar treatments and some vocal treatments, and it was very, very interesting. There was one thing he had, which whatever you sang into it came out blah 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 blah, which I used later down the line for an idea of mine with a thing called slogans. The idea, with a vocoder that he was something saying nothing. But he was very interesting to work with. So, he came in with a fresh perspective, because obviously it's like someone temping for the day. No one owns him. He can come in and he can be a radical and be a constructive radical, and talk about the way that something is cut. You can add an awful lot of treble to it if you like, and you can compress it a lot, and you can make a piece of music sound very different compared to the way you think it is. You think there's a piece of music, it's just going to sound like that, but it doesn't have to. So it was very nice to work with him, even for a day. Very, very nice.
To what extent was that actually reflected in the recording? Is his work in there?
Yes, it is. Yeah. I think it's Genesis at their most extreme. You've got these very dense keyboard patterns, so vocals have got to fit around that. I mean, from the word go, from the very first note. And then I was trying to make the sound of a fly, sort of buzzing around from speaker to speaker, which is there on the remix in its full glory. And I think in surround sound, it sort of buzzes about and does all those lovely things. It sounds just like a fly. There's a couple of fuzz boxes hooked up to do that. But you've got this sort of density, and so vocals are trying to break through that, and guitars trying to break through that, and you've got this competition going on the whole time. It's almost like heavy metal in terms of there's a wall of sound, there's a wall of sound, there's a wall of sound. You've got a density in the lyrics, and it creates a very claustrophobic atmosphere, a very urban kind of thing. That kind of urban decay of New York is reflected in those lyrics and in the very sound of it. It's breaking up, it's cracking. Like the New York streets themselves, because of the extremes of temperature, very hot in summer, very cold in winter. There are always these undulations in the tarmac. I think the album is a little bit like that, and it divides people. People either love it or hate it.
Who brought Eno in?
I think it may have been Pete, and it might have been Phil. Phil was working with Eno on some stuff, and sometimes Eno would work with him and say to Phil, I'd like you to do something, and it's 45 seconds long, and I've got an alarm clock, and I'm going to press that when it finishes. I don't mind what you play, it's just got the last 45 minutes. Music by the yard or by the minute or by the second. So, yes, the radicalism there, I think was very good, very good. Eno thinks of himself as an art teacher, and why not?
We've approached him.
Have you?
For an interview, yeah.
Oh, that's
just because I thought I'd like to meet him.
You'd like to meet him? Yeah, interesting guy.
I think he might say something quite interesting about Genesis. And
yes.
Through this experience, but maybe he's got other thoughts on that album
I'm sure.
in particular. Lamb.
Well, yeah, and he's a bright guy, and brought something to the plot that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So I think Genesis needed shaking up from time to time, so that radical thinking was important to change the comfortable aspect. I think too often bands can orientate towards the lowest common denominator with each other. If I'm going to engage one guy, I know that I better have something that is 12 strings. If I'm going to get something written with the band, if I can engage Mike with something that's a 12-string pattern and then get him to do another 12-string pattern, it'll probably be used. You start building alliances and little teams within the group. But to a certain extent, of course, that's going for a safe bet. It's much more radical to say, oh, should we do something atonal where we just play all the any old notes and try and make this clash working and come up with a few atonal runs. That's harder, I think. And yes, one isn't always applauded for those radical suggestions. There can be a resistance to that, and I quite understand. But album after album, it's important to try and shake things up a bit, rock the boat, upset the apple cart. Do that and do it constructively.
I was going to finish, but I just wondered if there's anything, because we've talked a lot about a whole range of stuff.
Yeah.
Great stuff, Steve. Is there anything that you feel, I really, I didn't quite say that right, or
okay.
I wanted to bring that out more?
Well, I do actually think that, in a sense, that it's unfortunate that the music that we did in the 70s is now known as progressive music, because at the time we didn't have that brief. We felt we could write something of any length, any subject matter. There were no rules. And I still feel that music should not have rules. Okay, you can set yourself personal goals within something, within a song, but you should be trying to surprise yourself. So if music doesn't have its quality of potential ambush, it's not really fulfilling its brief, and that might be an unlikely lyric, like "I know what I like." What is it about? You'll find out when you speak to Pete. It's like, watch this channel. The next episode coming. But I think that music should be flexible enough to be able to embrace every known form. It shouldn't be limited. Even the banjo. When you hear someone like Bela Fleck playing Debussy on a banjo, it can be done. It would have been nice, I think, if Genesis had used other musicians more readily and got in guests and worked with orchestras and gotten bigger, the Genesis Orchestra. Instead of which there was this tendency to want to look inwards and do it all themselves. So unlike the Beatles, I can't help applauding the Beatles for the fact that they decided to down tools and get in the old instruments to do the character portrait, which was Eleanor Rigby. And I think that if the band had done that, of course it could have developed a whole other way. But I think it was down to the various solo careers to do that.
Because when Phil gets his solo thing going, he also brought, I was thinking of the horns coming in.
Yes, yeah.
So then the horns actually did come in.
They did.
The Genesis, couple of tracks on Genesis.
Yes.
So it's kind of what you were saying. It's like that sort of expanding and bringing in different instruments and having the bigger sound, the big band sound sometimes, or the orchestra sound.
I'm sure Phil had to twist arms to get the brass players in. I'm sure, but it's important, isn't it? Because it's an extreme. It's not so much about whether you like each individual song. It's the great breadth of styles that the band encompassed. So I remember it being at school and somebody talking to us about Shakespeare and about Shakespeare, the great playwright, who'd done it all because he'd done comedy, he'd done tragedy, he'd done everything. So I think the challenge for any band or anyone in any endeavour in art is to try and do it all. Don't hold back. Keep it coming. Don't throw in the towel. Just keep in there. Okay, I'm getting didactic towards the end there, but
very inspirational.
Yeah. Oh, I hope so. I wish. Burn, stroke, bounce. Thank you. Thank you.
Should we cut?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you'll be using any of this, Frank.
We will cut.
Let's cut.